This is in by no way an exhaustive list of all of the books that I loved in 2019. Hey friends, what is up and welcome back to my channel. As you can tell from the title of today's video, we're doing my favorite books of 2019. Now, I had so many books that I absolutely loved in 2019, so this list in no way is going to be the extent of them. I'm actually doing 3 other videos of favorites. I know people online were like, no, if you're doing favorites past the first week of January, I'm not going to watch them. I literally don't care. Most of me putting stuff on YouTube is so that I can look back on it in the future. So I'm also going to have favorite romances, favorite comic books, and favorite gay reads of the year. Those are going to be separate videos. These books are books that I absolutely loved that I didn't really know exactly where they fit. Some of them are YA standalones, some of them are fantasy series I fell in love with, but I did want to sit down and give you this list. Now, my favorite read of the year isn't actually in here. You'll have to watch the other videos to figure out which one was my favorite, but I'm really excited to talk about the ones that I did like in 2019. I know there are so many of these videos out right now and I am sorry, but the first one that I want to talk about is The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. You guys know I fell in love with this series this year. This was a series that a lot of friends had talked about and said was one of their favorite series, and I'd kind of seen it around, but not really. James initially self-published this book. He is an Australian author and he was picked up by Orbit Books. Now Orbit did send me the most recent one. I'm really excited to read it. But the first book, The Shadow of What Was Lost, really captivated me. A lot of you guys have read this on my recommendation and really enjoyed it. This is an epic fantasy series. It's about a young man who is basically part of the society where these augurs went to war with people who are able to do certain types of magic, and basically you have to be, I don't know, you have to like take a test to be able to do magic in this world. Now, he has no magic and he is basically an augur, he finds out, and they go on this epic journey. This is an epic fantasy book, but the thing about this book and this series that I truly, truly love is no matter how big the books are, I think they're like 600 and some pages, the second one is 700 and some, and the third one is 800 pages. It is so incredibly easy to read, and that is what I really, really like about it. I think overall, for me, the world building could use a little bit of work. That's definitely something that lacks for me, but the characters, the overall story, all the little twists and turns within it, and the writing style itself really solidified this as one of my favorite series of all time. I was looking for a good fantasy series, like an adult fantasy series. I had like a really big craving for that, and picking up the book randomly and starting to read it and realizing how easy it was to read and how much it like enriched my life in a way, how much I fell in love with the characters. Like I said, this has become one of my favorite series of all time. The next book I want to talk about is actually a horror book, and that would be The Wicked by James Newman. This book was a book that I was not expecting to like as much as I did. Basically, this follows a family called the Littles, and they move from New York following an incredibly traumatic event with the wife of the family, and they move to a really, really small town. And basically, there is a demon that lives underneath the town that is there to try to really destroy everything, and it starts with a lot of children. And I wasn't really sure what the story was going to be about. I wasn't really sure if I was going to absolutely love it because I hadn't read horror in a really long time. Horror is a genre over the years that I have sort of distanced myself from because I do have OCD and it does sort of trigger my OCD if you're not familiar. But I did love this book. It was a lot more brutal than I thought it was going to be, and there was a lot more like sex and like erotica in it than I thought there was going to be as well, but I did really enjoy it. I actually ended up buddy reading this book with somebody, and it was a good choice, I think, because we were able to kind of like talk about like what we were thinking about things as we were going through. But the story itself was just written in a very atmospheric way at the same time, and I think that's something that I really craved from a horror book. It wasn't so much about the spooks, although there were some. It was definitely more about like the characters and what they were sort of going through and like their internal monologues and like their, you know, just like their thoughts on everything that was happening, and I really appreciated that. That is something that I've always been a fan of. It's something that I've loved from Stephen King over the years, so to find another horror author that sort of writes things like that, it really, really appealed to me. Now, like I said, the story is really brutal. There is a lot of child endangerment, there's a lot of child abuse in the book, there's a lot of just really gore heavy stuff in it, but it was just something that really spoke to my soul at the time. It was something that I have always been a fan of horror, so to find a book, like a horror book that I could really read, that I really, really enjoyed, that didn't trigger me, was definitely a benefit of 2019 for me. It's like gotten me back into the genre as well, so I am excited to continue with my horror reads in 2020, and this book was top of the list of my favorites. The next book I want to talk about is actually Collateral Damage. This book was a book that I was sent by Fake Crate, like in one of my Fake Crates is when I received it, and this book was actually a lot of fun. It is a YA book, but it follows our main character Meg, and she lives in basically like the alternate side of what it's like to live in a town with superheroes. So she's just a normal person, every day-to-day life, that gets roped into this town or lives in this town where superheroes are basically destroying the city. It's like superheroes and supervillains. And her main goal is basically just to protect herself and not become one of the casualties of, you know, like superheroes and supervillains fighting. But Meg one day finds one of the supers dead and he has been murdered, and she gets roped into this scheme with his girlfriend. And there's a lot of like backstory and a lot of things that happen, but the reason why this story really appealed to me is even though it is a YA book, I found it really fun to read. I found the characters really enjoyable, and I found the overall story actually really interesting. To see the alternate perspective of what it is like to just live in a town where things like this happen, I thought it was really, really fun. I thought it was an easy read. I thought it was an enjoyable read. I really liked the characters, and like I said, I liked the overall story. Of all the YA books that I read this year, this is definitely one of the top ones. It is a standalone. There aren't going to be any more, but I did really, really enjoy it, and I wish there were more, because I think that the overall theme of like living in a city when things like that happen, that's definitely not a perspective that we normally get things from. Normally it's from the perspective of like the superhero or the supervillain, so I did definitely appreciate that. The next book I want to talk about is Don't Date Rosa Santos by Nina Moreno. I absolutely loved this book. I gave this book, I think, 5 stars. And it was just so fun. Basically, it follows Rosa, our main character, and she lives in a really small Cuban town on the water. Now, she lives in the United States. Her family did come over, definitely very traumatically, and that's really what the story follows. It follows our main character, Rosa, wanting to find out more about her, you know, like family, where they come from, like their culture in itself. But her grandmother and her mom both don't really want to talk about it. Her mom has definitely flown the coop. She's not really around anymore. So Rosa does spend a lot of time with her grandmother. And one day they are getting ready for a festival in their town when somebody comes in and says, you know, this town has been like their like little port that they live in, basically is what they live in, has been bought up by a company, and they will be closing down some things and the festival will be canceled. So Rosa decides to hatch a plan to try to raise enough money to keep the town basically going, being able to have the festival and taking care of themselves. And I loved this story for many, many reasons. Rosa was both funny and bisexual, which I definitely enjoyed. Nina is also bisexual, I do believe, so writing herself into the story, I think a little bit definitely lent a lot of depth to the story. I also really liked Rosa just trying to connect with her grandmother. There's a lot of times where they speak about the food that they eat, and, you know, her just trying to get more information from her grandma on Cuba, because she wants to go to Cuba and to study. And when that falls through, she doesn't really know what else is left for her. So I also really liked the familial relationships in this book as well. I think Rosa is a stunning character. There's a little bit of hints of like magic in a way within the story with her grandmother, and I really appreciated that. I just think that the overall story of like community and family and finding yourself, I think, was really important, and I truly, truly recommend this book to everyone. The next book I want to talk about is Every Heart a Doorway. Now, I haven't read anything else in this series since I read the first one, but I did really enjoy this and would be interested to continue. Basically, this story follows our main character, Nancy, and she goes to a school that is owned by Miss West. And basically what it is, it's like a school for wayward children, but it's a little bit different because these are children who have fallen through doorways or have fallen through trunks and basically ended up in places that were not where we, you know, not our world. Now, I will say about the story, it is slightly confusing, but I think with Shannon's writing, it is more of a whimsical story, so it's more like reading a fairy tale as opposed to trying to read like a big book. These books are quite short, but I did really like it. Like I said, I really, really like Shannon's writing. I fell in love with it, which is saying something because I do not like whimsical writing. I don't like anything, you know, like too florally, to anything like that. That's not really my favorite. But I think the thing that I really, really loved about this was the characters, because Nancy comes back from the world that she has been living in and she has trouble adjusting. So Miss West does take her on along with a bunch of other kids. But what starts happening is kids start dying, and we're trying, like throughout the story, you're trying to figure out why. And I think that's what I really liked, seeing the characters, no matter how different they were, sort of come together to try to figure out like this great mystery. I really appreciated that. I think that this story is simple but beautiful at the same time, and while it does lack a little bit of overall story, I think there's not really like I don't know, just it didn't really feel whole to me in a way. I think because of the characters, that's why I will continue on with the series. And I know Shannon, as she is writing the rest of the stories, she is writing them from different perspectives of people that you get introduced to in this book, and I really appreciate that, and I am really excited to continue on with it. I just wish it had a little bit more meat to it, but overall I think because of the whimsicalness of it and the characters and just a little bit of the story they were able to get, I did still really enjoy it. The next book I want to talk about is Aurora Rising, and I like this book so far more than the Illuminae files, and that's saying something considering I gave the first book 4 stars. And the reason why I gave the first book 4 stars is, as much as I loved it, I felt the characters were pretty much a carbon copy of what you would expect from Illuminae, and they were kind of cardboard cutout, but I did still really like it. Basically what this is about a girl who is on a ship, and she is traveling with her parents and a bunch of other scientists and people to kind of populate another planet. But that ship is lost. And years and years and years later, a boy who is in this flight school for the government basically finds her ship and rescues her. And the story sort of takes off from there because the government is trying to hunt her down for many reasons, which I won't get into here because that would spoil the book for you. I do like ragtag team stories. You'll kind of notice that theme. I love stories with a lot of POVs. I love stories with a lot of different characters that you can kind of see yourself in at the same time. And now, while I didn't see myself in any of these characters, I did like reading from every single person's perspective, and I thought that was really cool. I think that having a lot of different characters lends a lot to a book. It brings like a lot of depth, I think, and that I really enjoyed. Now, there was one character that I did not like throughout the entirety of the book who I absolutely ended up loving by the end of it, and I think that says a lot to what I feel like Jay and Amy's writing has kind of evolved for me, because while I did like Illuminae, I felt like you can sort of expect the same things over and over again in each of the books. It was a lot of like, oh, are they gonna die? Oh no, they didn't die. Like, there's a little bit of a romance between 2 characters, like that kind of stuff. But the characters were incredibly funny. I liked the battle and fighting scenes in this. I thought that they were unique and definitely not something that normally I don't pay attention a whole lot to that. I'm more of a, I don't know, like dialogue or just, you know, just like normal writing kind of like reader. I don't really like pay attention a whole lot to the battle scenes, but I did in this, and I found that really refreshing because, like I said, I don't normally pay attention to things like that, and I did really enjoy it. I think that this series is going to be really fun. I think the second one is out or is coming out soon, and I'm going to be buddy reading that with a friend, the same person that I buddy read this one with, and I'm really excited for it because we did have a lot of fun reading it. I have like a new book boyfriend from this book. I have a new book girlfriend from this book. I just think that it was a lot of fun, and that is what really appealed to me for this. Like, even looking at it analytically, I did enjoy it, but enjoyment, like the rating that I would give it for enjoyment, I would give it 5 stars. I just thought it was a lot of fun. The next book I want to talk about is a book that I didn't think that I would like, that is one of the top 5 books that I read this year, and that would be Sorcery of Thorns. Basically, this is about our main character, Elizabeth, and she grows up in a great library because she is basically abandoned on its doorstep. And in that library, there are grimoires. And grimoires are basically books, when not contained, that can turn into monsters that basically wreak havoc on the world. And one day she is, you know, training to be this like protector of these grimoires, and a mage shows up in their town, and basically she gets roped into stuff and ends up leaving with him. And I think the reason why I love this story so much is for many, many reasons. One, I love the characters, and I love the overall story of grimoires. Like, as a reader, to think of like books actually coming to life and creating monsters, I thought that was really cool. I like the magic in this, but what I truly, truly loved were these secondary characters. There is a few main characters, one of which is bisexual, the other one is actually a demon, and of course those are the characters that I'm really drawn to. There's a bit of a love story in this. If you're not familiar with her writing, she tends to have more of a love story. She also wrote Enchantment of Ravens, and that is full on basically just a love story. And I feel like this book definitely has those elements in it, but is more about the magic and the overall story. And I like the inclusivity of the bisexual character. I think it was done really well. And I think this was just a really fun read. I actually read it in one day, and I was just so in love with it that I couldn't stop reading. And I remember it being over and me being really sad that it was a standalone. I would love to get more of a backstory on some of the other characters, and maybe even stories told from the other characters' perspectives. I think that would be really cool. But overall, this was just a fun read. It was like light and easy to read at the same time. I wasn't confused at all. It was just really, really fun for me. And a lot of, towards the end of the year of 2019, what I was reading was just basically purely for enjoyment, and this one was definitely top of the list for that. Now, one of my other favorite books of the year was the 3rd book in a series, and that'd be Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. This is a story about Vasya, who is a girl who, like, how do I say this without giving away the 3rd book? Because the 3rd book was definitely my favorite, I think, in the entire series as well. Vasya is a young girl whose mother dies, and her father remarries a woman who doesn't believe in the magic that their culture basically believes in. This is definitely told in like a Russian setting, I would say. They don't really pinpoint it, I don't think, within the story, but basically, she believes in these little, I would call them demons, that protect the hearth and the home and like their barns and their animals. And you have to sort of pay attention to them and give them offerings, because as with any god in most stories, the less you believe in them, the less powerful that they become. And when Vasya's stepmom, as I just call her the bitch because I hate her, as she kind of takes over, they start not paying attention to those things and those demons sort of start going away. But Vasya gets roped into the battle between the god of death and the god of war, and she sort of starts a relationship with them and basically overall protects the entire world from being destroyed. I love this series. The series had so much depth to it. It's one of those series that when you're reading it, because it does take place in the winter, you start feeling really cold and it's very atmospheric, but also what I really liked about the story is Vasya is not a likable character. Like through a lot of the story, she does some really unlikable things. There's no like placating to the reader of trying to make her seem better than she is. She is who she is. Now she is very strong, but she does also really struggle throughout the story. And I really appreciate that. Like I said, this is the third one, but overall this series, I would recommend it to anyone who's looking for a fantasy series, especially like a wintry sort of like, I don't want to say epic fantasy, but definitely not the average fantasy series that I think people are looking for. This series is kind of hard to read at times because it does have a lot happening. It does have a lot of perspectives. It does have a lot of depth to it, and I think that might turn some people off. But if you're looking for more of a challenging read with a lot more information and story to it, I think that you'd really like this one. So the next book I want to talk about is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. This book follows our main character, Spensa, and she's a daughter of a pilot who works basically for the military/government of the human race. And in this book, humans have sort of been forced to live on this planet to avoid these aliens that are attempting to kill them. And they spend a lot of their time trying to defend themselves. Well, one day her dad and a bunch of other pilots go out into space to try to protect them, and her dad basically betrays them. So Spensa and her family, her mom and her grandmother, are all basically kicked out of society. Now, there's nowhere really for them to go, so they do still live on the planet, obviously, but they are cast out in a way where they're not able to really work for themselves or work up to a way where they're really taken care of. They are where they are, and that's where they're going to stay. Well, Spensa decides she wants to be a pilot like her father because she doesn't believe that he betrayed him like everybody else does. So she applies to get into this flight school, and she is able to pass the test, but is essentially turned down because of who her father was. Well, somebody steps in for her, one of her father's old like battle buddies basically, and pushes to be able to have her in the program. And that's what the story follows. What I really liked about this, and this is one of those reoccurring themes that you'll see, is like the ragtag team, because the team that they form are basically the leftovers. And I really enjoyed that. I like seeing people from different backgrounds come together. But what I truly, truly loved about the story is I hated Spensa at the beginning of this book. I thought she was angry, which makes sense, but like violently angry to a point that I didn't really understand, and I didn't really get her character. But the more you read the book and the more circumstances that she's put into where she's given the option to be able to trust people or be able to lean on people, the more she grew. And I really appreciated that, because you guys know, or it's like a running joke, that I don't like a lot of female characters, and I think to an extent that is true, but it is because I feel like they lack in certain ways. And I feel like Brandon did a really good job of writing accurate character development for many of the characters throughout the story, but definitely for Spensa. I thought that she was phenomenal by the end of it, and really truly only Brandon Sanderson can make it so that my favorite character is actually a fucking spaceship. That's like the one thing that I really took away from the story is, yeah, my favorite character is definitely the spaceship in this story, but I really, really loved it, and I think a lot of people can definitely say it was one of their favorite books. This is the first Brandon Sanderson that I've read front to back, and it being his YA, it really makes me hopeful to read other things from him, especially like adult like fantasy stories that he writes, especially his epic fantasies, because I've been reading a lot more adult books recently, so we'll see. But overall, I think this was one of the top 5 books that I read this year. The next book I want to talk about will come as no surprise to anyone, because I've talked about this book with literally anyone who will listen to me, and it'll be The 10,000 Doors of January. This is my second favorite book that I read of the year, and this book follows our main character, January, and her dad works for a man basically collecting artifacts. And throughout the story, you sort of realize that they may be Indian American or Indian, I don't know necessarily know if it's like America at the time. So they're looked down upon by most people in society. And her dad isn't really present. Her dad is obviously off basically earning their keep for this man that sort of takes care of them. Well, one day January receives a gift from someone she thinks is her father, and it is a book. And within that book, as she is able to read it, she's sort of transported into the stories that she is reading, which then opens her up to the ability to be able to travel to different places. Now, the story I would say is very fantastical, bordering on magical realism. I saw somewhere on Twitter that there's like a difference between magical realism and another form of storytelling, so I'm not really sure necessarily where it falls into, but I would just consider this like fantastical or fantasy. It does take place in history, so I don't really know where it falls, but overall I really love this story. I think that it has like a great epic love story told throughout it, and as you are reading it you sort of realize where January's life falls in the stories that she is reading. Now there are characters throughout the story that I really enjoyed. Her father, a couple of the other secondary characters, but definitely her dog Bad. She has a dog named Bad who's literally just the most adorable thing, and my heart broke for him the entire time. But this book gave me a sense of like magic. Like when you are reading Harry Potter, you know, people really feel like, oh, I'm still waiting for my letter and I'd love to go there. And that's how I felt about this world. It made me believe in magic again. It was just written so well. And as you're reading it, you can definitely tell that Alex is also a reader. She definitely has nods to being a reader and consuming books. And it just like the whole story is about a book that brings you into stories. And I really like that. There's many different places that she travels to throughout the story as well. So I feel like there's a lot of world building that's available. And I feel like Alex really handled that really well as well. Take a shot every time I say well in this video. But overall, I loved this book. I would recommend it to anyone who's looking for more of a book about escapism. The only downside to this book I would say that a lot of people might run into is it is pretty slow. It's definitely a slow read because there is so much story that is to be presented in it, but I didn't mind that. I was just so excited to continue to read, and I truly loved it. I think I read it in like 1 or 2 days. That's how much I did enjoy it. Now, if you guys are not familiar, I have fallen in love with, many years ago, a game called Sweater, which is Star Wars The Old Republic, and it is an MMO game that you can obviously play online with your friends. Basically, you can choose if you want to be Sith or Jedi and what kind of faction you want to play into. Now, this year I started reading the Old Republic books. And one of the ones that really blew me away was Deceived. I really loved this book because Malgus is one of my favorite Sith characters altogether. He's the one who did the sacking of Coruscant. If you guys played the game, you kind of know. These books are sort of written to kind of go along with the game to tell a little bit more of the backstory. Malgus is basically a character who has a Twi'lek girlfriend throughout the entirety of the story, and it is more so told from his perspective, and I think that's why I really liked it. I don't want to give away too much in case people want to play the game, in case people want to read it, but basically what I really liked about the story is things told from Malgus's perspective. I found the secondary characters kind of blah and like the POV sort of pointless, but his story I think to me is always the most interesting because he is, as with most things, Jedis are not supposed to really have relationships. They're not really supposed to open themselves up to that because it does open up sort of a gray area that they're not really, you know, like they don't really want that to happen. They want to be pretty much, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to take care of. I don't have time for other things, anything that may sway my opinion. Sith, on the other hand, tend to be like, I want relationships, I'm going to do what I want to do, I will kill to get to the top. And for some reason that always really appeals to me. This story, if you're not familiar, Malgus is a Sith Lord who is trying to basically work his way to the tops of the ranks, and he really wants to destroy a Jedi in its completeness. And that is what the story follows. There's actually the sacking of Coruscant in this story as well, which I really appreciated. Malgus is also one of those characters who sort of battles with caring about his Twi'lek girlfriend. And at the end of the story, he does end up killing her. And it speaks a lot to who he is and who Sith are. And I think that's why I really liked it. As somebody who's played the game and who has experienced, obviously, the things that I've read in this book, it was a good add-on. But I think you can still read these stories. Like, I'm reading them in chronological order. I think you can still read them and get things from them even if you haven't played the games. The Old Republic is so rich with information and with, like, backstory. And I know Disney is thinking about doing stuff with the Old Republic, and it makes me really fucking nervous because I absolutely hated The Rise of Skywalker and The Force Awakens. I only liked The Last Jedi, and I'm worried that they're going to fuck it up. That's like my biggest concern, but I would like them to do well, and I would like the stories to be told, but until then I will just continue to read these books. But even if they're not canon anymore, I don't care. I think that they're fun to read, and I think that for what they are at the time, I think that they are worth it for a lot of people, especially if you're looking for more information on Star Wars or you want like to expand outside of maybe just the movies. I think this is a good place to start. Now, the next book I want to talk about is actually Summerbird Blue. This is a book that I have read other things by the author and was like, all right, I'm going to pick this one up, see what I think of it. And I absolutely fell in love with it. It follows our main character, Rumi, and her relationship with her sister, Leah, and they make music together. And Leah one day dies in a tragic car accident, so Rumi is sent to live with her aunt in Hawaii, basically to find herself, to heal a little bit, mostly because her mom needs time away from her to sort of heal herself. And this story has a lot of depth to it. It has a lot of things that I think are pertinent in today's day and age. Definitely death of someone important to you in your life and finding yourself again. Another thing that I really liked about this book is Rumi is asexual, so she doesn't really find herself overtly attracted to people, and I feel like it was just very casual in the story, and the way the secondary characters sort of handled that, I think that it was really, really awesome. I think it told a great story, and definitely something that a lot of people do experience, so I think it was important to have it in there as well. But definitely the grief in the story. I think the grief, as somebody who has lost a sister that they love, I think this book spoke to me for many reasons, and I definitely was much older when my sister passed, but the feeling of emptiness, or feeling like you've sort of lost a part of you, or things are unfinished between you and that person and they'll never be finished, that definitely really appealed to me, because there's a much older character that lives in the little city in Hawaii that they live in who has experienced loss himself, and they sort of start working together to sort of help each other heal, and he brings Rumi back to music, and that was really important. I think like learning how to handle grief, and especially because Rumi isn't a likable character, like the grief that she feels and how she expresses it was really jarring to me in the story, but it was still realistic. It is how people react. Like people with grief either tend to, I think, sort of heal and move on in a way that is really healthy for them, or they go the way that Rumi did, where they really start acting out and start being very difficult. And I appreciated the realistic other story, you know what I mean? Like it being told from that perspective. And I think that this story, if you have lost somebody, would be really important for a lot of people to read. And I definitely appreciated her writing the story. I think that it was really beautiful and will forever sit in my mind as one of my favorite books ever. The next book I want to talk about is the Western that I didn't know I needed, and possibly one of the most confusing books I've ever read, and it would be Wake of Vultures. Now this book follows our main character, Nettie Lonesome, and she is basically a slave to this family, and she dresses like a boy, tries to act like a boy, and I don't know if there's like more of a story there or not. I've only read the first one, and the series is pretty expansive. I plan on continuing, so I will let you know in later videos, but basically Nettie one day is out. She like hears something in the barn and goes to try to take care of the noise that she's hearing, and she's attacked by a man who ends up being a vampire. So this is a Western story with a lot of like vampires and werewolves and things like that in it, and definitely not the Western that I thought I needed. We ended up reading this for the bi-monthly book club, or at the time what was called Read, Rate, Review. It was my choice, I do believe, and I ended up fucking loving it. I think that the overall story for me was so different than what I normally read. Like it had some of like the supernatural things that I do like in my stories, but was definitely at its core a Western. And the only other Western I've ever read would be like The Gunslinger. And that really, I don't even know if you can consider that a Western. But I really enjoyed the story. I think that it was fun, and I think because Nettie isn't the most likable character, she became one of my favorite characters. I think she was very realistic. Like I said, she does struggle with like wanting to dress like a boy, and I'm not sure if that is from a trying to keep herself hidden because women are obviously like viewed as weak in this time, or if it is because that there's more like of a gender identity thing going on with her. But I really, really enjoyed it. I think that the mix of Western and supernatural was something that I didn't know that I needed, and I think the story being as fantastical as it is, and telling like the story that it did tell. There are children that are going missing, and it's sort of Nettie's job, along with the friends that she sort of picks up along the way, to figure out what is happening, and seeing all of them kind of grow and change throughout the story really spoke to me at the time that I read it. And like I said, I'm really excited to continue on with the series. This is a polarizing book. If you don't like Westerns, I don't think you'll like it. Like I said, it is very much so a Western, but one that I didn't know that I needed in my life. Alright guys, so those are all the books that I liked in 2019 that didn't really have a category to fit in. Let me know down below if you liked any of these, if you disliked any of these. Let me know what you think of them. But I love you guys so much. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video.